Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into something that should have been impossible. A world where millions of people, stripped of their languages, separated from their families, forbidden to read, forbidden to write, watched every waking moment by someone with a whip and a financial incentive to keep them silent, still managed to build one of the most sophisticated communication networks in American history. Tonight, we're talking about how enslaved people secretly communicated. And before you picture dramatic Hollywood scenes of whispered messages and midnight escapes, understand something. What actually happened was far more layered, far more ingenious, and far more beautiful than any movie has ever bothered to show you. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight, and whether anyone in your family ever had a secret language, a private code, or a look that could say an entire paragraph without opening their mouth. I read every single one. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Pull that blanket up. Tonight we're going somewhere where a song could save your life, and a quilt might be a map. Let's get curious for a second. Have you ever wondered what happens when an entire people are forbidden from talking to each other honestly? What do you do when your words are monitored, your gatherings are illegal, and even the drums your ancestors used to speak across distances have been outlawed because your captors understood, perhaps better than anyone, that communication is power? How do you warn someone that the overseer is coming? How do you tell your family 3 plantations over that you're planning to run? How do you teach your children to read when the penalty for literacy is mutilation or worse? How do you preserve a culture, an entire identity, when the system holding you down has made it its business to erase everything you are? And how did they build a communication network so effective that slaveholders themselves admitted, with a mixture of fury and bafflement, that intelligence could travel hundreds of miles among enslaved people in a matter of days? Congratulations. You've just woken up somewhere in the American South around 1845. You're not sure of the exact date because nobody tells you the date. Your property, your name, your real name, the one your mother whispered to you when you were small enough to fit in the crook of her arm, isn't the name anyone calls you by. The name on the ledger, the one the overseer shouts across the field, that's the name that matters to the people who own you. But your real name still lives somewhere in your chest, carried there the same way your grandmother carried songs from a place across the ocean that you've never seen, but somehow recognize in your bones. The horn hasn't blown yet. You're awake in that thin grey space before dawn, lying on a pallet made of corn shucks that crinkle every time you shift. The cabin smells like smoke and sweat, and the faintest trace of the sweet potatoes someone roasted in the ashes last night. Through the gaps in the walls, you can feel the damp creeping in, that particular deep south humidity that wraps around your skin like a second layer of clothing you didn't ask for. Somewhere outside, a rooster is warming up, and somewhere further off, a mockingbird is already running through its repertoire, cycling through stolen songs it's picked up from a dozen other birds, which, if you think about it, makes the mockingbird the most honest metaphor for everything that's about to happen tonight. Because the people in these cabins, your people, have become masters of borrowed sound, hidden meaning, and songs that say one thing to the ears of the overseer and something entirely different to the ears of the person standing right beside you. Here's the thing about communication under slavery that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. The system wasn't just physically brutal. It was designed very deliberately to make communication between enslaved people as difficult as humanly possible. Think about it. When Africans were first stolen from the continent and packed into the holds of slave ships, they weren't taken from a single nation or a single people. They came from the Akan, the Igbo, the Yoruba, the Wolof, the Mandinka, the Fon, the Yui. Dozens of distinct cultures with distinct languages, distinct traditions, distinct ways of understanding the world. And this diversity wasn't accidental from the slaver's perspective. It was useful. If the people chained together in the belly of a ship couldn't understand each other, they couldn't organize. If they couldn't organize, they couldn't rebel. Language separation was the very first instrument of control, and it started before anyone even set foot on American soil. On the plantations, that strategy continued. Slaveholders knew, either from hard experience or from the terrified warnings passed among themselves, that allowing enslaved people who spoke the same African language to remain together was a risk. So they separated them, deliberately, strategically. A Yoruba speaker might find themselves on a plantation surrounded by Igbo and Mandinka speakers, all of them forced to communicate in the broken English their captors insisted upon, none of them able to fully express in that borrowed tongue the depth of what they'd lost or the fury of what they felt. And yet, because here's where the story most people know ends, and the story you actually need to hear begins. They communicated anyway, not just in spite of the barriers placed in front of them, but in ways that turned those very barriers into tools. The inability to use a shared African language didn't silence them. It forced them to become the most creative communicators in American history. They invented new languages. They encoded messages in songs that their enslavers heard as nothing more than religious worship. They turned their bodies into drums when the actual drums were taken away. They developed hand signals, textile patterns, and oral codes that could relay information across plantations, across counties, across entire states. And they did all of this under the constant surveillance of people who had every economic incentive to stop them. Let's start with the thing they took first, the drums. In West and Central Africa, drums weren't just musical instruments. They were telephones, they were newspapers, they were emergency broadcast systems. Among the Akan people of what is now Ghana, drumming was a sophisticated language unto itself. A skilled drummer could reproduce the tonal patterns of spoken words, sending complex messages across miles of dense forest. Declarations of war, announcements of births and deaths, summons to gather, instructions to flee. The drum could say all of it, and only those who shared the drum language could understand. It was, in every meaningful sense, encrypted communication. The original end-to-end encryption, if you want to be modern about it, and it required no literacy, no written alphabet, no paper that could be intercepted and read by the wrong eyes, just rhythm, pattern, and a shared understanding of what each beat meant. The slaveholders understood this. Maybe not in those precise terms, but they understood it well enough to be terrified of it. In the early years of American slavery, before the laws caught up with the fear, some enslaved people were still permitted to drum. Saturday night gatherings, rare celebrations, the kinds of controlled outlets that slaveholders allowed because they believed, with the condescension that defined every aspect of the system, that it kept their property content. But the fear was always there. The knowledge that those rhythms might carry meaning the overseer couldn't decipher was a splinter lodged deep in the consciousness of every slaveholder in the South. And then came 1739, the Stono Rebellion. In September of that year, a group of about 20 enslaved people near the Stono River in South Carolina rose up against their captors. They gathered weapons, They marched south toward Spanish Florida, where freedom had been promised to escaped slaves, and they used a drum to coordinate, to signal, to call others to join them. The rebellion was eventually crushed with the kind of overwhelming violence that slaveholders reserved for anything that threatened the system. But the drum had done its work, not just in coordinating the rebellion itself, but in confirming every fear the planter class had ever harbored about the communicative power of African music. The response was swift and, in its own brutal way, logical. The following year, South Carolina passed the Negro Act of 1740, which, among its many dehumanizing provisions, specifically banned enslaved people from using drums, horns, or other loud instruments which may call together or give sign or notice to one another of their wicked designs and purposes. Read that language carefully. They didn't ban drums because they were annoying. They banned drums because they understood that drums were communication devices. They recognized, in the legal language of the colony, that sound could carry meaning, that rhythm could organize, that music could mobilize. And they were right. The ban spread. Other colonies adopted similar restrictions. By the mid-18th century, the drum, one of the oldest and most powerful communication technologies in human history, had been legally silenced across much of the American South. But here's the thing about silencing people who've been communicating through rhythm for thousands of years. You can take the drum. You cannot take the rhythm. And this is where the story gets extraordinary. Denied their drums, enslaved people transferred the rhythms into their own bodies. They developed what became known as patting juba or ham bone, a practice of slapping the chest, thighs, and arms in complex rhythmic patterns that replicated and extended the function of the drum. Your body became the instrument. Your palms against your ribcage carried the bass note. The slap of your hand against your thigh provided the snare. The stomp of your bare foot on packed earth kept the time. And the patterns weren't random. They weren't just entertainment, though they were that too. They carried the echo of everything the drum had been: community, identity, resistance, communication. The ring shout served a similar purpose. In gatherings that often happened in secret, in the woods, or in what became known as hush harbors, enslaved people would move in a circle, shuffling their feet, clapping their hands, and singing in a call and response pattern that could go on for hours. The shuffling feet on the ground produced a percussive rhythm that substituted for the drum. The clapping provided the accent. The voices carried the melody, and the whole thing happened despite and in direct defiance of the laws designed to prevent exactly this kind of gathering. Because what was happening in those circles wasn't just worship or entertainment. It was the maintenance of a communication network. It was the preservation of an entire cultural identity through sound, movement, and the collective refusal to be silenced. Let's go back to your cabin for a moment. Dawn is breaking, the horn is about to blow, and you're pulling yourself off that corn shuck pallet to face another day. But before you step outside, before the overseer's eyes are on you, there's a moment. Your mother is humming. She's been humming the same tune for 3 days now, and you've noticed that the melody has changed slightly since yesterday. A phrase has been repeated that wasn't there before. You don't think about it consciously, not in the way you'd think about a written message, but somewhere in your body, in that place where meaning lives below language, you understand. Something is shifting. Someone is coming, or someone is going. This is the world of the spirituals, and this is where the genius of enslaved communication reaches perhaps its highest expression. Spirituals are, on their surface, religious songs. Christian hymns adapted by enslaved people, sung in the fields during labor, sung in the cabins at night, sung in the brush arbor churches hidden in the woods. To the slaveholder, they sounded harmless, pious even. Some slaveholders actively encouraged religious singing, believing that Christianity made enslaved people more obedient, more accepting of their condition, more focused on the rewards of an afterlife rather than the injustice of the present one, which was, to put it mildly, a miscalculation of historic proportions, because the spirituals were doing double duty. On one level, yes, they were expressions of faith, of hope, of grief, of the profound need for something beyond the daily brutality of enslaved life. But on another level, they were a communication system so elegant that it operated in plain sight, in full hearing of the very people it was designed to deceive. The enslaved people who sang these songs understood something that their captors did not. That language is not fixed, that a word can mean two things at once, that a song about crossing the River Jordan can also be a song about crossing the Ohio River, that the Promised Land can be heaven and it can also be Canada, that Moses can be a biblical prophet and also a very specific woman named Harriet Tubman, who is 3 counties over and heading this way with plans. Frederick Douglass understood this perfectly. In his autobiography, he described how the singing of spirituals among his group of fellow enslaved people carried layers of meaning invisible to their enslavers. When they sang about being bound for the land of Canaan, a sharp observer might have detected something more than religious aspiration. Canaan was the north. The sweet chariot swinging low to carry them home wasn't coming from heaven. It was the Underground Railroad, and home was anywhere the Fugitive Slave Act couldn't reach. Consider the architecture of this system for a moment. No written codebook. No formal agreement about which words meant what. The code evolved organically, sustained by shared experience, shared suffering, and the shared understanding that survival required speaking in tongues the master couldn't translate. A song could function as a weather report, an escape plan, an all-clear signal, a warning or a farewell, depending on when it was sung, who was singing it, and what subtle variations the singer introduced. Speed up the tempo of a certain spiritual, and it means conditions are favorable. Slow it down, and it means danger, stay put. Tonight is not the night. Repeat a certain verse 3 times instead of 2, and the meaning shifts entirely. Harriet Tubman herself used this system with devastating effectiveness. When she returned to the South to guide people to freedom, she didn't send letters. She didn't draw maps. She sang. Tubman used spirituals to communicate with the people she was leading north, adjusting tempo, repeating phrases, and choosing specific songs to signal whether it was safe to move, whether they needed to hide, or whether danger was approaching. She reportedly mimicked the call of the barred owl when she needed to signal her presence without being seen, a sound so common in the southern night that no overseer would think twice about it. Imagine that. A woman who couldn't read or write, operating one of the most successful intelligence and extraction networks in American history, and her primary communication tools were a hymn and a bird call. But the spirituals weren't just useful for escapes. Their everyday function was equally critical. Work songs synchronized labor in the fields, yes, but they also transmitted news, conveyed emotions that couldn't be spoken aloud, and maintained the social bonds that the system was designed to destroy. When someone was sold away from the plantation, the songs changed. The grief was encoded in the music so that everyone knew what had happened, and the community could mourn together even if they couldn't speak about it openly. When a new overseer arrived and the dynamics of daily survival shifted, the songs adjusted. When a punishment was coming, a warning might thread through the melody like a dark stitch through fabric, visible only to the people who knew to look for it. Here's the thing about the spirituals that still doesn't get emphasized enough. They represent one of the most successful acts of cultural encryption in human history. For decades, an entire people maintained a parallel communication system inside the very songs their oppressors encouraged them to sing. The enslaver heard worship. The enslaved heard intelligence. Same song, same air, same moment. Two entirely different realities coexisting in the same sound wave. If that isn't genius, the word has no meaning. Now let's talk about the spaces where this communication happened when the singing stopped. Because some things couldn't be said even in code. Some conversations required darkness, distance from the big house, and the assurance that no one was listening who shouldn't be. Welcome to the Hush Harbor. Hush harbors, sometimes called brush arbors or praise houses, were secret gathering places deep in the woods or in remote clearings on the edges of plantations. They existed for one simple reason. Enslaved people needed spaces where they could communicate without surveillance. Officially, these were religious gatherings. Unofficially, they were everything. Church, town hall, courtroom, school, therapy session, intelligence briefing, and family reunion all rolled into one clandestine meeting that could get every person present whipped, sold, or killed if they were discovered. Getting to a hush harbor was itself an exercise in covert communication. You didn't receive a written invitation. Word spread through the same invisible network that carried everything else. A particular phrase worked into conversation during the day. A song selection at the right moment. A glance held just slightly too long. And when night came, people slipped away from their cabins one by one, moving through darkness they knew by feel, following paths they'd memorized by starlight, guided by sounds that the uninitiated would dismiss as nothing more than the ordinary noise of the southern night. The precautions taken at these meetings tell you everything you need to know about both the danger and the determination involved. In many accounts, including those collected by the Federal Writers Project in the 1930s, from the last generation of people born into slavery, formerly enslaved people described using overturned iron pots at their secret gatherings. The pots were placed upside down, with the opening facing the ground, and it was believed that they would catch the sound and muffle it, preventing the noise from carrying to the slaveholder's house or the ears of patrollers. One formerly enslaved man in Arkansas described going to a secret meeting house that only the enslaved knew about, where they turned iron pots face up and their slaveholder could not hear them. Did the pots actually work? The physics is debatable, but the practice tells us something more important than acoustics. It tells us that these people understood they were doing something dangerous, that they took deliberate, systematic measures to protect their communications, that they thought about sound the way an intelligence operative thinks about radio frequencies as something that could betray you if not properly managed. They weren't just praying in the woods. They were running a covert operation. Inside the hush harbor, away from the overseer's ears, a different world opened up. This was where the controlled language of the daytime, the coded songs, the careful words, the blank expressions could finally drop away. People spoke freely. They prayed in ways that had nothing to do with the obedience theology their enslavers promoted. They planned. They grieved. They strategized. They shared news from other plantations that had traveled through the grapevine, that remarkable informal network that connected enslaved communities across vast distances with a speed that baffled and infuriated slaveholders. The preachers in these spaces delivered a theology of liberation, not the carefully sanitized Christianity the slaveholders wanted their property to absorb. In the white-controlled churches that some enslaved people were required to attend, the message was clear: obey your masters, accept your lot, your reward comes in the next life. In the Hush Harbor, the message was radically different. God was a liberator. Moses wasn't just a biblical figure, but a template for present action. The Exodus story wasn't ancient history. It was a prophecy about what was coming. And the Jordan River they sang about crossing wasn't in the Middle East. It was north of the Mason-Dixon line. This is the dual reality of enslaved communication. In the light, every word was measured, every expression controlled, every interaction performed for an audience that held the power of life and death. In the darkness of the Hush Harbor, the performance ended, and the real conversation began. But let's not romanticize the darkness. Getting caught at a Hush Harbor meeting meant punishment that could range from a severe whipping to being sold away from everyone you loved. Patrollers, those roving bands of white men whose job was to enforce the slave codes and catch enslaved people moving at night without passes, were a constant threat. The woods weren't safe. The paths weren't secure. Every gathering carried risk, and yet people went anyway, week after week, year after year, generation after generation, because the need to communicate freely, to worship without performance, to plan without surveillance, was worth the risk. It was, in its own way, as essential as food and water. You can starve a person's body by denying them bread. You can starve a person's soul by denying them the right to speak honestly with another human being. The Hush Harbor fed that soul, so you've survived the night. You made it to the gathering and back without being caught, and now the horn is blowing and another day of labor begins. But the communication doesn't stop just because the sun is up. If anything, it becomes more intricate, because now you're operating in full view of the people who own you, and every signal has to be invisible to them while remaining perfectly clear to the people around you. Let's talk about the grapevine, not the literal plant, although that's there too, climbing up the side of the smokehouse. The grapevine was the informal communication network that connected enslaved people across plantations, counties, and sometimes entire states. And it worked with a speed and reliability that drove slaveholders absolutely mad. One contemporary observer noted, with obvious frustration, that enslaved people had a wonderful art of communicating intelligence among themselves, and that information could travel several hundred miles in a week or two. Think about that. In an era before telephones, before telegraphs reached most of the South, before any reliable postal service connected these rural plantations, enslaved people were transmitting information across hundreds of miles in days, without writing it down, without any formal infrastructure, without anything that a slaveholder could intercept and read. How? Through the same people the slaveholders themselves relied on. The domestic slave trade, which tore families apart and scattered people across the South, inadvertently created exactly the kind of dispersed network that's hardest to shut down. When your cousin was sold to a plantation in Alabama, and your brother was hired out to a farm in Tennessee, and your aunt was working in the kitchen of a townhouse in Charleston, you had contacts, whether intentional or not, spread across a vast geography, and enslaved people who had mobility, the coachmen who drove their masters between plantations, the boatmen who worked the rivers, the draymen who hauled goods into town, the blacksmiths and carpenters who were hired out to neighboring farms. These mobile workers became the backbone of the grapevine. A coachman driving his master to a neighboring plantation could exchange a few words with an enslaved person there. A boatman stopping at a riverside landing could pass along a message. A hired-out carpenter working on a barn 20 miles from his home plantation could learn that a particular slave catcher was operating in the area, and that information could travel back through the network before the slave catcher even arrived. It was intelligence work, not the kind practiced in gilded offices with wax seals and diplomatic pouches, but intelligence work nonetheless. The collection, transmission, and distribution of information critical to survival. And the slaveholders knew it was happening. They just couldn't stop it. Because the same system that gave slaveholders their wealth, the movement of goods and labor across the South, required exactly the kind of enslaved mobility that made the grapevine possible. You couldn't run a plantation economy without sending your coachman to town, without hiring out your skilled workers, without allowing some degree of movement among the people you claim to control completely. The grapevine grew in the spaces the system itself created. It was a parasite on the host of slavery, feeding on the very infrastructure of oppression. Now, let's step inside for a moment, into the kitchen, into the big house, because some of the most valuable intelligence gathered by enslaved people came not from the fields or the forest, but from the dining room table, the parlor, and the bedroom of the slaveholding family. Domestic workers, the cooks, the maids, the valets, the nursemaids, occupied a unique and exquisitely dangerous position in the information ecosystem of a plantation. They were, by definition, insiders. They served meals while their enslavers discussed business. They cleaned rooms where letters lay open on desks. They dressed children who repeated things their parents had said at dinner. They stood in corners, quiet, supposedly invisible, while their owners talked about debts, auctions, sales, politics, and the price of cotton. The slaveholders saw this as a non-issue because they saw their enslaved domestic workers the way you might see a piece of furniture. Present, functional, and fundamentally incapable of understanding or acting on what they heard. This was, to be diplomatic about it, monumentally stupid, because those quiet figures in the corners were listening, processing, remembering, and relaying. A cook who overheard her mistress discussing the upcoming sale of a field hand didn't keep that information to herself. It traveled through whispered conversations in the kitchen, through a message passed to a field worker who relayed it to the quarters, through the grapevine to the person who was about to be sold, giving them whatever slim chance existed to prepare, to hide, to run. A valet who heard his master discussing plans to crack down on nighttime movement could warn the community to lay low, to postpone the hush harbor gathering, to keep to their cabins until the danger passed. This domestic intelligence network was so effective that some slaveholders eventually became paranoid about it. They'd lower their voices when enslaved people entered the room. They'd send them away before discussing sensitive matters. They'd restrict the flow of information within their own households. But the damage was already done. The system required domestic labor, and domestic labor came with ears and a memory and a community waiting to hear what those ears had caught. Here's where it gets even more remarkable. Some enslaved people weaponized literacy itself, despite every law and every lash designed to prevent it. The anti-literacy laws across the South were among the most telling pieces of legislation in American history. Not telling because they were cruel, although they absolutely were. Telling because of what they revealed about the slaveholders' understanding of power. They knew that a person who could read could access ideas beyond the plantation. They knew that a person who could write could compose a pass, forge a document, send a letter, or record what was being done to them. They knew that literacy was the difference between a person who could only receive information through controlled channels and a person who could seek it out independently. So they made it illegal. In state after state, teaching an enslaved person to read or write was a criminal offense. The punishment for the teacher could be a fine or imprisonment. The punishment for the enslaved person who learned was far worse. And yet, people learned anyway, because the desire to communicate, to access information, to participate fully in the world of meaning and knowledge is not something that legislation can extinguish. It's something closer to a basic human drive, like hunger or the need for warmth. You can make it dangerous. You can make it punishable. You cannot make it disappear. The methods were as varied as the people who used them. Some learned from the slaveholders' children, who were too young to understand the significance of what they were doing, and who sometimes taught their enslaved playmates the alphabet as part of a game. Some learned from sympathetic white people, often Quakers or abolitionists, who risked their own freedom to provide instruction. Some taught themselves, painstakingly matching the shapes of letters in discarded newspapers to the sounds they heard white people making, assembling literacy letter by letter like building a house one brick at a time. Frederick Douglass learned through a combination of guile and determination. His mistress in Baltimore began teaching him the alphabet before her husband intervened, arguing that education would make him unfit for slavery. That single sentence told Douglass everything he needed to know about the relationship between literacy and freedom. He continued learning in secret, trading bread to white children in exchange for reading lessons, carrying a book hidden on his person, practicing letters in the margins of his young master's schoolwork. He understood that every letter he learned was an act of rebellion, a quiet declaration that the system's definition of him as property was a lie. But here's the thing about secret literacy that doesn't get enough attention. When an enslaved person learned to read, they didn't just gain a personal skill. They became a node in the communication network. They could read the newspapers their masters discarded and learn about abolitionist activity, about legal changes, about the political debates that would determine whether slavery expanded or contracted. They could read the notices posted in town about slave auctions and warn the people about to be sold. They could read the handbills offering rewards for runaways and pass along descriptions of the slave catchers to watch for. A single literate enslaved person on a plantation could function as a living newspaper, translating the written world into the oral network that connected everyone. And some went further. Some wrote, forged passes that allowed people to move through the countryside without being stopped by patrollers, letters that carried coded information between plantations, documents that, if intercepted, would have meant death. The act of writing, for an enslaved person, carried a weight that most of us today cannot fully comprehend. Every stroke of the pen was simultaneously a practical tool and an existential statement. I am a person who thinks, who plans, who communicates. I am not what you say I am. Let's talk about a form of communication so creative, so audacious, that it deserves its own place in the history of human ingenuity. Let's talk about Tudnese. Tut, also called Tudnese, was a spoken language developed by enslaved people roughly 250 years ago. Not a pidgin, not a creole, not a collection of borrowed words. A constructed language, built from scratch, designed specifically for secret communication. In Tut, every vowel is pronounced as its letter name, and every consonant is assigned its own unique word. So the letter B might become bub, and the letter D becomes dud, and a simple English word is transformed into a string of syllables that sounds like gibberish to anyone who doesn't know the code. The beauty of Tut was its simplicity and its adaptability. It didn't require literacy to learn, since it was taught entirely by ear, passed from parent to child, and from community member to community member through oral instruction. But it could be used to spell out English words, which meant it also functioned as a secret literacy tool. A person who couldn't read could still learn to spell by learning Tut, because the system mapped sounds to letters in a way that made the alphabet accessible without a book. It was simultaneously a communication code and an educational technology, encrypted and instructional at the same time. Different regions developed slightly different pronunciations, which makes sense for a language transmitted orally over 2 centuries. In some families, the letter W was pronounced wax. In others, it was wug. The letter H might be hug or hush, depending on where your people were from. These regional variations are themselves evidence of how far the language spread and how many communities independently maintained it. And here's the part that still resonates. Even after emancipation, even into the 20th century, many African American families kept Tut alive. Not because they still needed it for survival in the literal sense, but because it had become something more than a code. It had become a cultural inheritance, a reminder of what their ancestors had built under the worst possible conditions, a thread of continuity reaching back through generations. Some families were encouraged to keep the language secret well into the 1970s, because speaking a language white people couldn't understand was still considered provocative, still perceived as threatening, still characterized as uppity. The language that enslaved people created to protect themselves continued to require protection long after slavery officially ended. Let that settle in for a moment. Now, let's widen the lens. Let's talk about the kinds of communication that happened not through sound or language, but through the physical world, through objects, through arrangement, through the quiet grammar of things placed just so. On a plantation, your world was full of signals if you knew how to read them. A garment placed in a particular spot near a window could tell a husband hiding in the woods that it was safe to approach after dark. Married couples separated by circumstance, where one had escaped and was living as a maroon in the nearby swamp or forest, developed signaling systems so personal and so specific that they were essentially unbreakable by anyone who didn't know the 2 people involved. One documented case describes a couple where the wife would place a specific piece of clothing in a visible spot near her cabin. Her husband, who had escaped and was living covertly in the surrounding woods, knew to look for it. If it was there, conditions were safe. If it wasn't, stay away. If a different item appeared, it meant something else entirely. A system as simple as a shirt on a fence post and as secure as any cipher ever devised. This principle extended to the physical arrangement of spaces. The way a door was left open or closed, the direction a broom leaned against a wall, the placement of a candle in a window. These microsignals, invisible to anyone not attuned to their meaning, created a layer of communication that operated entirely below the threshold of the slaveholder's awareness. You could walk through a plantation landscape and see nothing but the ordinary clutter of daily life. But if you were part of the community, if you knew the grammar, every object was a sentence. Let's move to what might be the most debated, most romanticized, and most fascinating theory about enslaved communication: the quilts. The idea is gorgeous. Quilts hung on clotheslines or draped over windowsills, embedded with patterns that served as coded maps and instructions for people fleeing toward freedom on the Underground Railroad. A bear paw pattern meaning follow the animal trails through the mountains. a flying geese pattern, meaning head north, follow the birds. A log cabin blog meaning this house is safe, stop here, you can trust these people. It's the kind of story that captures the imagination because it centers creativity, community, and beauty in a narrative that is so often reduced to suffering. Here's where honesty matters, because this channel doesn't deal in comforting myths when the truth is available. The quilt code theory is genuinely contested among historians. The primary source for the theory is a book called Hidden in Plain View, published in 1999, which draws on the oral testimony of a single quilter named Ozella McDaniel Williams, whose family passed down the story of quilt codes through generations. The story is compelling. The problem is that no independent corroboration has been found. No quilt codes appear in any of the thousands of formerly enslaved people's narratives collected by the Federal Writers Project in the 1930s. No period letters, diaries, or abolitionist writings mention them. No original coded quilts survive. Several quilt historians have pointed out that some of the patterns cited in the theory didn't actually exist during the peak years of the Underground Railroad. But here's the thing about demanding written evidence from a people who were forbidden to write. It's a paradox that several scholars have noted, and it's worth sitting with. The absence of written documentation doesn't prove absence of practice in a culture where documentation was literally illegal. Oral traditions, by definition, don't leave the kind of paper trail that satisfies the standards of academic history. And the fact that the quilt code story resonates so deeply within African American communities that it has been passed down through families and incorporated into cultural memory suggests that something about it touches a real nerve, even if the specific details can't be verified. What we can say with more confidence is this: quilts and textiles absolutely were part of enslaved people's lives. Enslaved women were skilled quilters who made utilitarian quilts from scraps and old clothing. And the broader principle that everyday objects could carry hidden meanings, that physical arrangements could function as signals, is thoroughly documented, even if the specific quilt code sequence isn't. So whether or not quilts functioned as a literal map system for the Underground Railroad, they existed within a culture that was saturated with hidden communication, where every object potentially meant more than it appeared, and where the line between the practical and the symbolic was never as clear as outsiders might assume. What's beyond dispute is that the Underground Railroad itself was a masterwork of covert communication. Not an actual railroad, of course, and not really underground, but a loose, sprawling, constantly shifting network of routes, safe houses, and guides that helped an estimated 100,000 people escape slavery in the decades before the Civil War. And it ran on communication, word of mouth, coded letters, signal songs, trusted contacts, a vast, decentralized information network with no central office, no membership roster, no hierarchy that could be decapitated by capturing a single leader. The railroad language itself was a code. Freedom seekers were called passengers, parcels, or bundles of wood. The guides who led them, people like Harriet Tubman, were conductors. The safe houses where they hid were stations, and the people who owned them were station masters. Others who helped along the way were agents. And because the railroad was still a relatively new technology in antebellum America, this vocabulary was novel enough that it didn't immediately flag as suspicious. A letter referring to a parcel arriving at a station on Thursday night could be discussing an actual shipment, or it could be discussing a human being fleeing for their life. The communication methods used by conductors were as varied as the people who filled the role. Tubman's use of spirituals and bird calls has already been mentioned. Others use lanterns in windows. Others use specific markings on fences or gatehouses. Some communities used word-of-mouth chains so reliable that a message could pass through a dozen hands and arrive intact at its destination. The system was designed to be redundant, so that the capture of any single person wouldn't compromise the entire network. It was designed to be flexible, so that routes could shift when certain paths became too dangerous. And it was designed to rely on trust, on the deeply personal bonds between people who had proven, through repeated action, that they could be relied upon. Here's the thing about the Underground Railroad that the stories don't emphasize enough. It was primarily built and maintained by black people. Yes, white abolitionists played important roles. Yes, Quaker communities in the North provided critical shelter. But the network's foundation was laid by formerly enslaved people who went back, by free black communities in the North who organized support, by enslaved people on plantations who risked everything to pass along information to those who were running. Harriet Tubman herself made roughly 13 trips back into slave territory, not fleeing each time, but returning voluntarily, walking back into danger to lead others out. The communication network that made this possible wasn't given to enslaved people by sympathetic outsiders. It was built, maintained, and operated by people who understood, from the inside, what was at stake. But the Underground Railroad wasn't the only place where coded language flourished. Let's go back to the everyday world of the plantation and talk about something that doesn't get nearly enough credit as a communication tool. The mask. Not a physical mask. Something subtler. Something more powerful. What scholars have called the mask of accommodation. The carefully constructed persona that enslaved people presented to their captors every single day of their lives. Imagine performing a role 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for your entire existence. Imagine that the character you play is docile, grateful, dim, content, loyal, and just simple enough to be unthreatening. Imagine that your survival depends on the quality of this performance, that a flicker of intelligence in the wrong moment, a flash of anger that's too honest, a display of knowledge you're not supposed to have, could bring the lash or the auction block or worse. Now imagine maintaining that performance while simultaneously running a covert communication network under your performer's nose. That's what enslaved people did every single day. And the mask itself was a form of communication, not between the enslaved person and their captor, but between enslaved people themselves. Because everyone in the quarters knew about the mask. Everyone understood the difference between the person you showed the overseer and the person you actually were. And that shared understanding, that collective awareness of the gap between performance and reality, was itself a bond, a form of community knowledge that said, we all know what's happening here. We all know who we really are. The performance is for them. The truth is for us. The face you showed the slaveholder communicated compliance. The face you showed your community communicated solidarity. And the ability to switch between these two faces, instantly, seamlessly, without a trace, was a skill taught from childhood. Mothers taught their children how to lower their eyes at the right moment, how to say, "Yes, sir," with just the right amount of deference, how to appear busy without actually exerting themselves beyond what was necessary. These weren't lessons in submission, they were lessons in survival, in the art of controlling what your captors perceived, while preserving what they couldn't see. Every blank expression was a locked door behind which the real self continued to live, to think, to plan, to hope. And here's where the mask connects to something deeper. because the performance wasn't just individual, it was communal. Enslaved people communicated to each other through the quality of their performances. If someone's mask slipped, if their behavior toward the slaveholder changed in a way that was too sudden or too noticeable, the community noticed. A person acting more deferential than usual might be hiding something. A person acting less careful might be signaling that they'd given up caring about consequences, which could mean they were about to run. Changes in the mask were data. Deviations from the usual performance were messages, and the community read those messages the way you'd read a change in weather, instinctively, continuously, without having to be told what to look for. Now, let's walk away from the big house and the fields for a moment. Let's go to a space that might surprise you. The kitchen, on a large plantation. The kitchen was usually a separate building, set back from the big house to keep the heat and the fire risk at a distance. It was staffed by enslaved cooks, mostly women, who were responsible for feeding the slaveholder's family and, in many cases, for preparing the food distributed to the enslaved community as well. And it was, quietly, one of the most important communication hubs on the entire plantation. Think about who passed through the kitchen. Everyone. The house servants who carried the meals, the field workers who came to collect rations, the children who begged for scraps, the slaveholder's wife who came to give instructions, the visiting neighbors who stopped in to gossip. The kitchen was a crossroads, a place where people from every part of the plantation's social world intersected, and the cook stood at the center of it all. She heard the house gossip from the servants. She heard the field news from the workers. She heard the slaveholder's plans from the slaveholder's wife. And she had the opportunity, in the controlled chaos of meal preparation, to pass information in every direction. But the kitchen communicated in other ways too. The food itself could be a message. When an enslaved cook added a particular ingredient to a dish, or prepared a specific meal, or set aside an unusual portion. These acts could carry meaning within the community. Cooking extra food before a nighttime gathering at the Hush Harbor, preparing provisions that could be carried by someone planning to run, setting aside certain herbs that had medicinal or spiritual significance. The kitchen was a space where women, who are too often left out of narratives about resistance, exercised a form of power that was invisible to the slaveholder but essential to the community. And the food traditions themselves were a form of communication across time, a way of preserving African identity in a land designed to erase it. The cultivation of okra brought from West Africa, the expertise in rice cultivation that enslaved people from the Senegambia region carried in their knowledge and their hands, an expertise that literally made the fortunes of the Carolina Low Country planters who claimed credit for it. The preparation of one-pot stews and dishes that echoed the cooking methods of homeland's most enslaved people would never see again. Every meal that preserved a West African technique or ingredient was a message transmitted across the Atlantic and down through generations. We remember. We remember where we came from. We remember who we are. This food is our history, and every time we cook it, we are telling a story that no law can criminalize and no overseer can stop. Let's step deeper into the night now. You've eaten what passed for supper, a piece of cornbread and some fatback, maybe a sweet potato you roasted in the coals. The cabin is dark. The fire has burned down to embers that pulse with a faint orange glow. Around you, the sounds of the quarters settle into the rhythms of night. A baby fussing, a murmured conversation through a shared wall, the creak of someone shifting on a straw pallet, and then from somewhere in the darkness, a voice begins to sing. This isn't a work song. This is something different. something older, something that carries in its melody a geography of grief and defiance that spans an ocean. It's quiet enough that the overseer, if he's even listening, would dismiss it as someone putting a child to sleep. But the people in the surrounding cabins recognize the song. They recognize the slight variation in the melody that wasn't there last night, and they understand. This is the night communication network at work. The daytime had its codes, its work songs, its grapevine, its domestic intelligence. But the night had its own language, softer, more vulnerable, more intimate. In the darkness, when the mask could finally come off, when the performance for the slaveholders' benefit could finally end, the communication changed in texture. It became more emotional, more spiritual, more personal. The songs sung at night in the quarters weren't just transmitting information. They were processing grief, expressing love, mourning loss, celebrating small victories, affirming in the face of a system designed to dehumanize that the people singing were fully, irreducibly human. A mother singing to her child in a slave cabin was doing more than soothing an infant. She was transmitting culture. The melodies she chose, the words she used, the rhythmic pattern she rocked to, all of it carried encoded information about identity, history, and values. By the time that child was old enough to understand language, they'd already absorbed hundreds of hours of cultural transmission through song. They knew the melodies of their community the way they knew the sound of their mother's voice, instinctively, cellularly, in a way that no slaveholder could reach or erase. This is why music was so central to enslaved communication, not just because it was practical, although it absolutely was, but because it operated on multiple levels simultaneously. It transmitted information. It maintained cultural identity. It processed collective emotion. It built community solidarity. It provided cover for coded messages. And it did all of this while also being simply beautiful. The spirituals that enslaved people created are among the most profound artistic achievements in American history. And they were created under conditions that would have crushed most people into silence. Instead of silence, there was song. Instead of erasure, there was creation. Instead of the death of culture, there was its most remarkable flowering. Let's talk about naming. Because even names were a form of secret communication. On the plantation ledger, you had one name, the name your slaveholder gave you. Usually a single name, a first name only, often chosen with deliberate condescension. Classical names like Caesar, Pompey, or Cato were common, a cruel joke that compared human property to the great figures of Rome. Short, simple names that were easy for the overseer to shout across a field, names that belonged to the slaveholder as surely as the person who carried them. Names that could be changed on a whim, that followed the property rather than the person. But in the quarters, in the nighttime spaces, in the hush harbors and the whispered conversations between parents and children, different names lived. African names, day names from the Akan tradition, given based on the day of the week a child was born. Names that honored ancestors, names that carried meaning, that connected a child born in Georgia or Mississippi to a lineage stretching back across the water to Senegambia or the Gold Coast or the Bight of Biafra. These secret names were acts of communication so intimate and so defiant that their very existence was a challenge to the slaveholders' authority. When a mother gave her child an African name in the quiet of a cabin, she was saying, "You are not what they call you. You come from somewhere. You belong to someone. You have a history that began long before this plantation and will continue long after it. The name your enslaved community knew you by was the name that mattered. the name that carried your real identity. And the practice of secret naming continued for generations, a chain of whispered identity stretching from the earliest days of American slavery through emancipation and beyond. Now picture this. It's Sunday, the one day of the week when the rhythm of the plantation loosens, just slightly, like a fist unclenching half an inch. Some slaveholders allowed their enslaved workers a partial day of rest on Sunday. Some required attendance at the white-controlled church service in the morning, where a white preacher delivered carefully curated sermons about the duty of obedience. But the afternoon, for some, was their own. And this is when the communication networks came alive in ways that the work week didn't allow. Sunday was visiting day. On plantations that permitted it, enslaved people could visit family members on neighboring farms. A husband on one plantation might walk miles to see a wife on another. Children might visit grandparents sold to a nearby estate. And every one of these visits was an information exchange. News traveled with the visitors. Who had been sold? Who had been punished? Who was planning something? What the slaveholder had said at dinner, what the crops looked like, whether the patrollers were active. The Sunday visiting circuit was the grapevine in its most concentrated form, a weekly pulse of information that kept the scattered communities connected. And then there were the market days. In some parts of the South, enslaved people were allowed to sell produce they'd grown in their own small garden plots. These market gatherings, held in town squares or at crossroads, brought together enslaved people from different plantations in a setting that was ostensibly about commerce, but was really about communication. You could exchange information with a stranger from a plantation 30 miles away, while haggling over the price of a basket of eggs. You could receive a message from someone's cousin's friend about conditions up north while inspecting a bolt of cloth. The market was another crossroads, another node in the network, another space where the slaveholder's system inadvertently created the conditions for the very communication it was designed to prevent. Here's another layer that doesn't get talked about enough: the role of enslaved people who were hired out. Hiring out was a common practice in which a slaveholder would rent an enslaved person's labor to another person for a period of time, keeping the wages for themselves. Skilled workers like blacksmiths, carpenters, coopers, and seamstresses were frequently hired out, sometimes to employers miles from their home plantation. And every hired out worker was a mobile communication node. They moved between worlds. They had access to information from multiple plantations, multiple towns, multiple communities. They could carry a message from one side of a county to another in the course of their normal work without anyone thinking twice about it. Some hired out workers even lived semi-independently in towns and cities, paying their slaveholder a fixed amount and keeping whatever they earned above that. These urban enslaved people had access to a completely different information environment. They could hear political news. They could interact with free black communities. They could encounter abolitionist literature. They could learn about legal developments that might affect their status. And they could carry all of that information back to the plantation when they returned. The hired out worker was, in intelligence terms, an agent with access to multiple networks, capable of bridging the information gap between the rural isolation of the plantation and the broader world. Let's talk now about a form of communication so subtle that it borders on the invisible: the language of the body. Enslaved people communicated constantly through physical gesture and positioning, a vocabulary of movement so refined that it could convey complex messages without a single word being spoken. The tilt of a head, the pace of a walk, the direction of a gaze. the way someone held their shoulders or positioned their hands. These physical signals operated below the threshold of the overseer's attention because they looked like normal human behavior. Everyone tilts their head. Everyone looks in a particular direction. But within the enslaved community, specific gestures had specific meanings, agreed upon through practice and transmitted through observation. A person walking past the big house at a pace slightly slower than usual might be signaling that the slaveholder was home and in a foul mood. A worker in the field who straightened up and stretched at an unusual time might be indicating the overseer's position to someone who couldn't see him directly. A mother calling her child in from play with a particular tone or gesture might be telling the child not just to come inside but to be quiet. Something is happening. Stay close. The body was the final communication medium, the one that could never be confiscated, never be outlawed, never be physically separated from the person using it. And this is connected to something even more fundamental: the enslaved community's ability to read emotional states without verbal communication. In a world where honest speech was dangerous, people developed extraordinary sensitivity to non-verbal cues. They could read a slaveholder's mood from the way he sat on his horse. They could sense a change in the plantation's atmosphere, a tightening that preceded punishment or sale, from the behavior of the house servants who had heard something the field workers hadn't yet. This collective emotional awareness was itself a form of communication, a shared sensing of conditions that allowed the community to adjust its behavior in real time without anyone needing to say a word. Now let's talk about the children's games, because even play was a medium for communication. On the plantation, children both black and white played together in the early years before the full weight of the system descended on enslaved children, usually around age 7 or 8 when they were sent to the fields. But within enslaved children's play, there were games that served a double purpose. Clapping games that taught rhythmic patterns connected to the patting juba tradition. Singing games whose lyrics contained the same coded language as the adult spirituals. Storytelling traditions that passed down survival knowledge in the form of animal tales. Brer Rabbit and his endless contest with larger, more powerful creatures who always seemed to end up outsmarted. The Brer Rabbit, stories adapted from West African trickster tales like those of Anansi, the spider, among the Akan people, were a masterclass in encoded communication. On the surface, they were entertainment for children, but every child in the quarters understood, even if they couldn't articulate it, that the small, apparently powerless rabbit, who outwitted the fox and the bear, was a stand-in for the enslaved person who outwitted the slaveholder. The stories taught strategy. They taught that intelligence could overcome physical power. They taught that the appearance of weakness could be a weapon. They taught that words could be traps and silence could be armor, and that the creature who looked like prey could become the one setting the snare. And they transmitted these lessons in a form so entertaining and so apparently harmless that no slaveholder would think to ban a story about a rabbit. But it went deeper than the stories themselves. The very act of storytelling in the quarters was a communication, ritual. The elder who told the story chose which tale to tell on a given night, and that choice was never random. A story about outsmarting a predator on the night before a known troublemaker visited the plantation. A story about patience and waiting for the right moment during a season when tensions were high and impulsive action could get someone killed. A story about sticking together when the community needed solidarity. The storyteller was a communicator in the fullest sense, selecting and shaping narratives to meet the community's present needs while wrapping those messages in a form that delighted children and comforted adults, and left no evidence that anything subversive had occurred. Let's also acknowledge the communication that happened through craft and material culture. Enslaved people who practiced basket weaving, a skill brought from West Africa and particularly preserved among the Gullah and Geechee communities of the Carolina Low Country, incorporated patterns and designs into their baskets that carried cultural meaning. Coiled sweetgrass baskets woven in styles traceable directly to Sierra Leone and Senegal carried within their construction a conversation with Africa that continued across centuries and an ocean. The patterns weren't necessarily codes in the way that the quilt theory suggests, but they were communication nonetheless. They said, "Our traditions survive, our knowledge persists, our hands remember what our mouths were forbidden to say." Pottery too, woodworking, the carving of walking sticks with faces and symbols that carried meaning only the carver and his community understood, the decoration of spaces within the quarters, even the arrangement of objects in the small personal spaces that enslaved people managed to carve out for themselves within the tiny geography of a cabin. All of it was communication, with the past, with each other, with the future, with anyone who had the eyes to see it. Now let's talk about something that sits in the uncomfortable space between fact and tradition, between verified history and the oral knowledge of a people who were denied the tools of verification. Let's talk about the natural world as a communication system. Enslaved people developed an intimate knowledge of the landscape that surrounded them, and this knowledge was itself a form of communication, passed down through generations and shared within communities. The stars, most famously, the North Star and the constellation known as the Drinking Gourd or the Big Dipper, served as navigational tools that required no written map and could never be confiscated. Knowledge of which plants were edible, which had medicinal properties, which rivers ran in which direction, which animal trails led to water, which tree moss grew on the north side. All of this was survival information communicated person to person, parent to child, elder to community. The natural world also provided cover for communication. Birdsong, as Tubman demonstrated, could be mimicked to signal between people without alerting anyone who might be listening. The sound of a whippoorwill at the wrong time of night, the call of an owl from an unexpected direction. These could be natural sounds, or they could be a person communicating through nature's vocabulary. The woods themselves, the deep woods that bordered the cultivated fields, were simultaneously a danger and a sanctuary. They were where the hush harbors met, where runaways hid, where the overturned pots caught the sound of forbidden worship. The relationship between enslaved people and the natural landscape was a communication channel that the slaveholder's system could never fully monitor or control, because the land itself was the medium, and no legislature in the world can pass a law against reading the stars. And rivers. The rivers deserve their own mention. The song "Wade in the Water" is believed by many to have carried a practical message. Get in the water to hide your scent from the tracking dogs that slaveholders used to pursue runaways. Whether or not that specific interpretation is historically verified in every case, the principle is sound. Water disrupts scent trails. Enslaved people who were intimately familiar with their local waterways could use creeks, streams, and rivers not just as escape routes, but as communication about escape routes. Knowledge of where to cross, where the water was shallow enough to wade, where the banks offered cover. All of this was information shared within the community and critical to anyone contemplating flight. And here's something else about the natural world that connects back to African traditions. In many West African cultures, the natural environment was understood as a living communication system. Trees, animals, weather patterns, and celestial bodies all carried meaning. This wasn't superstition. It was a different way of reading the world, a framework in which nature itself was a text that could be interpreted by those who knew how. Enslaved people brought these frameworks with them across the Atlantic, and they adapted them to the American landscape. The rustle of certain birds taking flight could signal a human presence in the woods. The behavior of animals at certain times of day could indicate whether a path was safe. The direction of the wind, the phase of the moon, the position of certain stars, all of these were data points in a navigational and communication system that predated European arrival on the African continent by millennia. Now here's a piece of the communication puzzle that often gets overlooked entirely: the role of free black communities as communication bridges between the enslaved world and the wider one. Not every black person in the antebellum South was enslaved. Free black communities existed in cities like Charleston, New Orleans, Baltimore, and Richmond, as well as in smaller towns and rural areas across the South. These communities occupied a precarious legal position, constantly under threat of having their freedom challenged or revoked, subjected to discriminatory laws and the ever-present danger of being kidnapped back into slavery. But they also occupied a unique position in the communication landscape. Free black people could move through spaces that enslaved people couldn't. They could enter stores, churches, courthouses. They could subscribe to newspapers. Some could own property and conduct business. Some were literate, and many maintained connections through family, friendship, or shared community with enslaved people on nearby plantations. These connections made free black communities critical nodes in the information network. They could relay news from the outside world into the enslaved community. They could serve as intermediaries for the Underground Railroad. They could provide forged documents, safe meeting places, and access to resources that enslaved people couldn't obtain on their own. The relationship between free and enslaved black communities was itself a form of communication that the slaveholders found nearly impossible to police. A free black barber in Charleston, who cut the hair of both white and black clients, occupied a position from which he could gather intelligence from the white world and relay it to the black one. A free black seamstress who did work for slaveholding families could observe, listen, and carry information back to her own community. A free black preacher who traveled between churches could serve as a courier for the grapevine, carrying news across distances that no enslaved person could safely travel. And the slaveholders knew this too. Laws restricting the movement and activities of free black people were enacted precisely because the planter class understood that free black communities served as communication hubs and potential bases of support for resistance. In some states, free black people were required to carry papers proving their status at all times. In others, they were prohibited from entering certain areas or conducting certain kinds of business. These laws were, at their core, attempts to disrupt the communication channels that free black communities provided. And like every other attempt to silence enslaved and black communication, they were only partially successful. The networks adapted. They found new routes around the restrictions. They continued to function because the people who maintained them understood that the flow of information was, quite literally, a matter of life and death. Let's circle back to your day, because the sun is high now and you're in the field, bent over cotton that stretches to the horizon in every direction, and the overseer is on his horse at the edge of the row, watching. Even here, communication doesn't stop. It adapts. The work songs that regulate the rhythm of labor in the cotton field are doing more than keeping everyone synchronized. They're carrying information. A lead singer sets the pace and chooses the words. And if the overseer on horseback understood what those words really meant, he'd probably fall off his horse. The call and response structure of the work song is itself a communication technology imported from West Africa. One voice calls out a line. The group responds. The call can be adjusted in real time. The response confirms receipt. It's a protocol, in the technical sense, a structured exchange of information in which the format is fixed, but the content is flexible. And it's happening right under the overseer's nose, in full volume, in broad daylight, and he has no idea that the song about crossing the water is actually about the creek that marks the boundary of the next county, or that the verse about laying your burden down is a message about the location of a cache of food hidden for anyone who decides tonight is the night they leave. The field itself has its own grammar of signals, the speed at which someone works, the direction they face, the placement of a water bucket, the arrangement of picked cotton in a row. These micro-communications are nearly impossible for an outsider to detect because they exist within the normal visual noise of plantation labor. An overseer sees workers picking cotton. The workers see each other communicating in a language made of gesture and position, as fluent and as specific as any spoken code. But here's where the communication of the field takes on a different dimension, because the work itself could be a form of resistance and a form of message. Slowdowns, deliberate inefficiency, the subtle art of working just slowly enough to reduce the slaveholder's profits without being slow enough to trigger punishment. This was a collective decision, communicated through the unspoken consensus of the work gang, and it required coordination. Everyone had to slow down together, gradually, imperceptibly, maintaining the appearance of effort while reducing the output. If one person slowed down alone, they'd be singled out and punished. If everyone did it together, the overseer faced a different problem. He couldn't whip everyone, and he often couldn't tell whether the slow pace was deliberate or simply the result of heat, exhaustion, or poor conditions. This is communication as collective action. The decision to slow down didn't happen through a formal meeting or a vote. It spread through the same invisible channels that carried everything else. A rhythm shift in the work song, a shared glance, a pace set by the lead worker that everyone instinctively matched. The ability to coordinate collective resistance without verbal agreement is perhaps the most sophisticated form of communication enslaved people developed, because it required not just shared knowledge, but shared intent, transmitted through nothing more than the quality of attention people paid to each other. Sabotage worked the same way. A broken tool that wasn't quite broken enough to look deliberate. A gate left open that allowed livestock to wander. A fire that started in a storage building under circumstances that were suspicious but unprovable. Poisoned food prepared by a cook who knew exactly which roots from the forest's edge would cause illness without leaving a trace. A horse that went lame after being improperly shod by a blacksmith whose skills were otherwise impeccable. These acts of resistance were also acts of communication. They said, "We are not passive. We are not content. We are extracting a cost from this system, one broken hoe and one wandered cow at a time." And the slaveholders understood the message, even if they couldn't prove intent. The constant anxiety that something might be sabotaged, that a fire might start, that a tool might break at the worst possible moment, was itself a psychological toll imposed by enslaved people on their captors through actions that spoke louder than any words could. And let's not overlook the spiritual dimension of all this communication. because for enslaved people, the spiritual and the practical were never separate categories the way they are for most of us today. Hoodoo, the folk spiritual tradition that blended African spiritual practices with elements of Christianity and Native American herbalism, provided an entire additional layer of communication and meaning-making. Spiritual practitioners within the enslaved community interpreted signs and omens, prepared protective charms, and served as counselors and advisors whose authority derived not from the slaveholder's system, but from the community's own spiritual traditions. The language of hoodoo, its symbols, its materials, its rituals, was a communication system in its own right, one that connected enslaved people to a spiritual world that the slaveholder couldn't enter, couldn't control, and often didn't even know existed. A small bundle of herbs hung above a doorway, a particular arrangement of objects at a crossroads, a whispered conversation with a root worker about a dream that seemed to carry a warning. These were communications that operated in a register entirely separate from the practical intelligence networks we've been discussing, but they were just as real and just as important to the people who relied on them. The spiritual communication network affirmed that there were forces at work beyond the slaveholder's power, that the universe itself was on the side of freedom, that the suffering of the present was not the whole story. In a world where every material reality was controlled by the system of slavery, the spiritual world remained a domain of freedom, a space where enslaved people communicated with powers that no overseer could see and no law could regulate. Let's shift now to the creation of new languages, because the story of enslaved communication isn't just about encoding messages in existing English or preserving African languages in secret. It's also about the extraordinary process of building entirely new ways of speaking. When enslaved people from dozens of different African language groups were thrown together on plantations with no shared tongue, they didn't simply learn English and leave their linguistic heritage behind. They created something new. First Pidgin languages, simplified communication systems that blended elements of English with African grammatical structures and vocabulary. Then Creole languages, fully developed linguistic systems that grew from those pidgins as new generations were born, speaking them as their native tongue. These Creole languages were far more than broken English, as they were dismissively characterized by slaveholders and later by historians who should have known better. They were complete languages with their own grammar, syntax, and vocabulary, capable of expressing every human thought and emotion with the same precision as any language on earth. And they served a critical dual function. On one level, they allowed communication between enslaved people from different African backgrounds, building community across the linguistic barriers that the slave trade had deliberately created. On another level, they were partially opaque to the slaveholders. A slaveholder might understand enough of the Creole to give orders, but the nuances, the jokes, the coded references, the emotional registers of the language, those were accessible only to the speakers. Think about what that means. The slaveholders forced English on enslaved people as a tool of control. And enslaved people took that English, remixed it with the grammatical structures and vocabulary of a dozen African languages, and created something new. Something that served the slaveholder's purpose just enough to avoid punishment, but belonged in its deeper registers entirely to the people who spoke it. They weaponized the very language of their oppression. They turned the master's tongue into a tool that the master couldn't fully comprehend. If that isn't the ultimate act of communicative resistance, nothing is. The Gula language, preserved among the Gula Geechee communities of the Carolina and Georgia Low Country, is the most well-known surviving example. Gula incorporates vocabulary and grammatical features from multiple West and Central African languages, blended with English into a Creole that is both American and African, both a practical tool and a cultural archive. To hear Gula spoken is to hear the echoes of a communication system that was built under duress, that survived centuries of pressure to abandon it, and that still carries, in its rhythms and its words, the imprint of the African cultures that gave it birth. And the linguistic legacy extends far beyond Gula. What we now know as African American Vernacular English, or AAVE, carries within its grammatical structures and its vocabulary the traces of those original Creole languages. The tonal patterns, the use of aspect rather than tense in certain verbal constructions, the rich tradition of verbal play and signifying, all of it connects back to the linguistic creativity of enslaved people who took the language imposed upon them and made it their own. Every time someone speaks of, they're speaking in a linguistic tradition that began on slave ships and in slave quarters, a tradition born from the same communicative genius that built the entire hidden network we've been exploring tonight. Anglican clergy in the colonial period reported with bewilderment that Africans on the plantations spoke little or no English, but stood around in groups talking among themselves in strange languages. Those strange languages were the Creoles being born in real time, built from necessity and creativity in equal measure, constructed in the narrow spaces that the system of slavery left unguarded. Every word of those languages was an act of cultural creation. Every conversation held in them was a declaration that the people speaking had not been reduced to the silent property their legal status claimed them to be. Let's go somewhere specific now. Let's go to the river. It's late afternoon, and the overseer has sent you and 2 others down to the creek to haul water. It's a job nobody wants in the heat, dragging heavy buckets up a muddy bank, but you volunteered. And here's why. The creek is out of sight of the big house. The sound of the water covers quiet conversation, and the woman walking beside you has news. Her sister's husband was hired out to a farm near the county seat last week, and while he was there, he heard talk. A man passing through town, a free black man carrying papers, mentioned that conditions along a particular stretch of the northern border had changed. A new family had moved into a farmhouse near the river crossing. Sympathetic people, the kind who might leave a lantern in a window. None of this is spoken in plain language. It comes out in pieces, tucked between complaints about the heat and observations about the state of the creek. A name, dropped casually, that you recognize as a code. A direction reference that you know refers not to the creek, but to a route. A detail about a lantern that sounds like idle chatter, unless you know what it means. The entire conversation takes maybe 3 minutes, conducted while filling buckets, and by the time you're hauling water back up the bank, you've received an intelligence briefing that has traveled over 100 miles through a chain of trusted contacts, none of whom wrote a single word down. This is how it worked. Not dramatic, not cinematic, practical, quiet, embedded in the ordinary fabric of daily life so thoroughly that it was invisible to anyone who didn't know to look. The genius wasn't in any single technique. It was in the system as a whole. A system that used every available medium, sound, silence, gesture, song, object, food, craft, performance, and absence of performance, to maintain a flow of information among people who were legally prohibited from communicating. And let's be clear about one more thing before we begin to close. The slaveholders knew, on some level, that they were losing this battle. The constant expansion of slave codes, the ever-tightening restrictions on gathering, movement, literacy and expression, the creation of patrols and the hiring of overseers whose primary job was surveillance. All of it was evidence of a system that understood it was being outmaneuvered by the very people it claimed to control. Every new law banning drums or assembly or literacy was an admission that the previous ban hadn't worked. Every expansion of the patrol system was an acknowledgement that enslaved people were still communicating, still moving, still organizing, despite everything done to stop them. The irony is profound. The slaveholders built a system of control that was, by the standards of its era, comprehensive. They controlled the legal system, the economic system, the educational system, the religious system, and the physical environment of the plantation. They had the authority to punish, to sell, to separate, to kill. And with all of that power, they could not prevent the people they enslaved from talking to each other, from singing to each other, from passing information through networks so sophisticated that intelligence could traverse hundreds of miles without leaving a trace that the slaveholders could find. That failure tells you everything you need to know, not about the weakness of the slaveholder system, which was brutally effective at extracting labor and destroying lives, but about the strength of the human drive to communicate, to connect, to resist, to insist, against all evidence to the contrary, that you are a person with a voice and that your voice will be heard. And then there are the children, because one of the most remarkable aspects of enslaved communication was how it was transmitted across generations. Children on a plantation learned the codes the same way they learned everything else, by immersion. They absorbed the double meanings of songs before they fully understood what the songs were about. They learned to read the signals of adult behavior, to understand when a certain quiet fell over the quarters that meant something was happening, to recognize the difference between ordinary conversation and coded communication. By the time an enslaved child was old enough to work in the fields, they were already fluent in a system of hidden communication that had taken centuries to develop. They didn't need a textbook. They had something better, a community that taught through living. And the teaching was itself an act of trust and an act of communication about what mattered. When a grandmother sat with a child and taught them the words of a spiritual, she wasn't just teaching a song. She was initiating that child into a tradition. She was saying, "This is who we are. This is how we survive. These words mean more than they seem. And someday you'll understand the layers. But for now, learn the melody, learn the rhythm. Carry them in your body the way I carried them in mine, the way my mother carried them before me." The transmission of culture through song was a conversation spanning generations, each generation adding to the tradition while keeping its core intact. This intergenerational transmission is perhaps the most impressive achievement of all, because the system of slavery lasted for centuries and the communication networks within it had to be rebuilt, adapted, and maintained across multiple generations under conditions designed to prevent exactly this kind of cultural continuity. Every generation of enslaved people inherited the codes, refined them, added new ones, and passed them on. It was a living tradition, as dynamic and responsive as any language, evolving in real time to meet changing conditions while maintaining its core function. The preservation of community, identity, and the possibility of freedom. Consider the sheer logistical challenge. Families were torn apart by sale. Communities were disrupted. People were scattered across hundreds of miles. And yet the communication system persisted. New arrivals to a plantation were absorbed into the existing network. Children born into the system were taught its rules before they could fully comprehend them. People who were sold away carried the knowledge with them to their new location, planting seeds of the network in new soil. The system was, in modern terms, anti-fragile. It didn't just survive disruption, it used disruption to spread. And there's one more dimension to all of this that deserves attention before we begin to wind down. The emotional communication. The communication that wasn't about transmitting tactical information, but about maintaining the psychological and spiritual health of a community under constant assault. Grief in a slave community was communal and constant. Someone was always being sold. Someone was always being punished. Someone's child was always being taken away. And the way enslaved people processed this grief together, through song, through shared silence, through the collective rituals of the hush harbor, through the simple act of sitting together in a cabin and letting someone cry, was itself a form of communication. It said, "You are not alone in this. Your pain is witnessed. Your loss is recognized. We hold it together because no one can hold it alone." Joy, too, because there was joy, even in slavery. The laughter that filled the quarters on a Saturday night when someone produced a fiddle and the dancing started. The delight of children playing before the work claimed them. The warmth of a shared meal, however meager. The electric thrill of a birth. A new life entering the world against all odds. These moments of joy were communicated and shared with an intensity that comes from knowing how fragile happiness is when it exists inside a system designed to destroy it. Every celebration was an act of defiance. Every laugh was a message. They haven't broken us. Not yet. Not today. The communication of love was perhaps the most dangerous and most necessary of all. In a system where marriages between enslaved people had no legal standing, where a slaveholder could separate a husband and wife at any time for any reason, where children could be sold away from their mothers before they were weaned, love was an act of extraordinary courage. To love someone in slavery was to make yourself vulnerable to a kind of pain that the system could inflict at will. And yet people loved, fiercely, completely. And they communicated that love through every channel available, through the names they gave their children, through the songs they sang at night, through the food they prepared with care from almost nothing, through the stories they told and retold, through the secret visits conducted at enormous personal risk across plantations that might be miles apart. A man walking 12 miles on a Saturday night to visit his wife on another plantation, risking the patrollers, risking punishment, risking his own exhaustion before another week of brutal labor, was communicating something so fundamental that it needs no code to interpret. I am here. You matter to me. This system says you are property, and I am property, and our bond means nothing. And I am walking through the night to tell you with my presence that the system is wrong. But here's the thing about all this that sits heaviest. This extraordinary system of communication, this tapestry of songs and signals and hidden languages and whispered intelligence, existed because it had to. It was born from the specific conditions of one of the cruelest systems of human exploitation ever devised. Every creative solution was a response to a specific form of oppression. Drums were banned, so the body became a drum. Writing was forbidden, so songs became letters. Gathering was criminalized, so the woods became a church. Language was stripped away, so new languages were built from scratch. The genius is undeniable, but it's a genius forged in fire. Every code, every signal, every hidden meaning represents not just creativity, but necessity. Not just ingenuity, but survival. And the people who built these systems weren't doing it for the intellectual satisfaction of solving a communication problem. They were doing it because their lives, and the lives of everyone they loved, depended on it. And what they built didn't disappear when the chains came off. The communication networks enslaved people created became the foundation for everything that followed. When emancipation came, those same networks organized communities, built churches, founded schools, and created the institutional infrastructure of free black life in America. The churches that had existed as invisible institutions in the woods became the visible pillars of black communities across the South. The oral traditions that had carried coded messages became the wellspring of an entire artistic heritage. The call and response pattern that had coordinated labor in the cotton field became the structural backbone of gospel music, which became the backbone of blues, which became the backbone of jazz, which became the backbone of rock and roll, which became the backbone of hip-hop. Follow that thread from a cotton field in Mississippi to a recording studio in Memphis, to a concert hall in Harlem, to a turntable in the Bronx, and you're tracing a communication lineage that began with people who were forbidden to speak freely, but spoke anyway. The Gullah Geechee communities of the Carolina and Georgia Low Country still speak their Creole language today, still weave their sweetgrass baskets, still sing their shout songs, still maintain the cultural continuity that stretches, unbroken, from West Africa, through slavery, through emancipation, through Jim Crow, through the civil rights movement to the present day. When you hear a Gullah Geechee choir sing, a ring shout in a praise house on St. Helena Island, you are hearing a sound that has been carried in human voices for over 300 years. A sound that survived the Middle Passage, survived the auction block, survived the ban on drums, survived everything that was thrown at it. That isn't just cultural preservation. That's communication across time itself, a conversation between the past and the present conducted in song and rhythm, and the stubborn refusal to let a tradition die. And Tutneza. Remember Tut, the language enslaved people built from scratch. Families are still keeping it alive, still teaching it to their children, still passing along the syllables that their ancestors created in secret and whispered in the dark. Some scholars have called it a dead language, but the families who speak it know better. It's sleeping, maybe, resting, waiting to be called back into active service if the world ever decides again that certain people don't deserve to be heard. And in the meantime, it lives in kitchens and living rooms and family gatherings, a quiet monument to the ingenuity of people who built a language because they were denied the right to use the ones they already had. Here's something else worth considering. The techniques enslaved people developed, the double-coded language, the use of music to transmit information, the reliance on trusted networks, the reading of environmental signals, the maintenance of hidden identities alongside public ones. These techniques didn't just influence black culture. They influenced the entire American intelligence tradition. When the Union Army needed scouts and intelligence operatives during the Civil War, they turned to formerly enslaved people who already had generations of experience in covert communication, surveillance detection, and information networking. Harriet Tubman herself served as a Union spy, leading the Combahee River Raid in 1863, which liberated more than 700 enslaved people. She was, by then, the most experienced intelligence operative in the country, with a track record of successful covert operations spanning over a decade, and her tradecraft, her ability to move undetected, to communicate through signals and songs, to maintain networks of trusted contacts. All of it was developed not in any military academy, but in the fields and forests of the antebellum South. The tradition continued through the civil rights movement, where the black church once again became the organizational backbone of resistance, where freedom songs carrying double meanings echoed the tradition of the spirituals, where information networks within black communities coordinated boycotts, sit-ins, and marches with a sophistication that owed everything to the centuries of practice that came before. When Martin Luther King Jr. stood in a church in Montgomery or Birmingham and used the language of the Exodus to describe the freedom struggle, he was drawing on the same communicative tradition that had sustained enslaved people in those same southern states 100 years earlier. The river they were crossing was the same river. The promised land they sought was the same promise. And the communication networks that made the movement possible, the phone trees, the church networks, the word-of-mouth chains, the coded conversations conducted in the awareness that phones were tapped and meetings were surveilled, all of it traced its lineage back to the grapevine, to the hush harbor, to the spirituals sung in the field. So tonight, as you settle into the quiet, let me tell you what you've survived. You've walked through a world where the sound of a drum could start a revolution, and the silence of its absence could spark something even more powerful. You've followed the melody of a spiritual from a cotton field to a safe house on the Underground Railroad. You've stood in a hush harbor with the iron pots turned down and the real words finally flowing. You've watched a woman place a shirt on a fence post and understood that the simplest act could carry the most complex message. You've seen a mother hum a melody to her child that carried within it the compressed history of an entire people. What the people in these stories built was more than a communication network. It was a civilization's refusal to be unmade. Every song encoded with a double meaning was an assertion that the human mind cannot be enslaved, even when the body can. Every message that traveled the grapevine across hundreds of miles was proof that connection between people is something no law can sever. Every child who learned the codes through immersion in a community that refused to let its traditions die was a victory over a system that spent centuries trying to achieve exactly that extinction. They did all of this. Every coded song, every secret name, every whispered message, every clapped rhythm that replaced the outlaw drum. Without technology, without legal protection, without any of the tools that we take for granted today, they had nothing but each other, and each other was enough. So tonight, as you lie in your comfortable bed, with your phone on the nightstand and the world's information a tap away, whisper a quiet thank you to the people who sang in code and prayed behind overturned iron pots and taught their children forbidden alphabets in the dirt. They ran so that you could rest. They spoke in secret so that their descendants might one day speak freely. They built out of rhythm and melody and the placement of a shirt on a fence post, a communication network that defied one of the most powerful systems of oppression the world has ever known. And their legacy isn't just in the past. Every time you speak truth to power, every time you share information that someone doesn't want shared, every time you use your voice, your art, your music, your words to connect with another human being, in defiance of a system that would prefer your silence, you are carrying forward a tradition that stretches back to those cabins and those fields and those hidden gatherings in the woods. The spirituals are still sung. Tut is still spoken in families who chose to remember. The rhythms that were banned from the drum and transferred to the body still pulse through every genre of American music. The communication network that enslaved people built didn't just survive slavery. It shaped the culture of an entire nation. Gospel, blues, jazz, hip-hop, all of it carries the DNA of those coded songs, those double meanings, Those voices that found a way to say what needed to be said, even when saying it could cost you everything. History has a way of forgetting the people who built the most extraordinary things under the worst conditions. But tonight, you didn't forget. You listened. You lay in the dark and you imagined what it was like to live in a world where a song could be a map and a quilt might be a signal, and the rhythm of your own hands on your own body was an act of defiance against an empire that feared the sound you carried inside you. So close your eyes now. Let the soft hum of the fan take you the rest of the way. And as you slip towards sleep, carry with you the knowledge that the most powerful communication network in American history wasn't built with wires or towers or satellites. It was built with voices, with courage, with the stubborn, beautiful, unbreakable human need to be heard. Sleep well, rest deeply, and remember that every act of honest communication, no matter how small, echoes back across the centuries to the people who proved that silence is never the final word. Good night.